This is a 125 mile an hour capable diesel multiple unit, and in Britain we have completely forgotten how to build these. But it's okay, because bi-mode units, that is, units that use overhead electric wires and have underfloor diesel traction units, can save the day. They can do just the same thing, as the rail minister said 1 year ago.
One of the reasons that further electrification of the Midland Main Line went down the list is because the trains that were bought as bi-mode trains will produce better service, more capacity, and will be better trains, and they will be able to use the wires where they exist and be able to run where they're not.
That was a year ago. A week ago, though,
East Midlands Railway has reduced a number of its services from today until further notice. It's due to continuing problems with the new fleet of trains.
It's not just the Midland Main Line that's causing problems, though. Across the country, we're seeing more overcrowding and fewer trains running than we had in 2020. That's exactly what we're going to be looking at with a load of statistics and data on a city-by-city and operator-by-operator basis, so that we can understand exactly what the state of Britain's railways are today. Everyone, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. And as the Intercity 225 fades away, this week, in one of his first acts as Prime Minister, Andy Burnham returned the bus fare cap to the level it was set to under Boris Johnson in 2022. Of the bottom fifth of UK earners, fewer than half have access to a car. So this is a valuable and useful policy change. But does it go far enough? And as we see timetable cuts across the country, most notably a decimation of services on the Midland Main Line towards Sheffield, is the bus fare policy just a case of tokenism to claim a quick win in an uncertain political climate? You see here the now ex-MD of East Midlands Railways here stood next to one of the new trains looking rather pleased. How quickly times change. Burnham's bus fare cap came amidst various calls from policy experts to ease cost of living pressures hitting more and more households. As we talked about last week, one of these was a report by the New Economics Foundation getting moving on the cost of living, which also recommended free travel for under 25s and the merging of the various disparate rail cards into a single national rail card that anyone can apply for, similar to the current network rail card for those living in London and the South East. Aside from mortgage and rent payments, transport is the largest and second largest household expense in rural and urban areas, respectively. So such measures would greatly lessen costs for those relying on public transport. Assessing the economics of these proposals, in other words, how much they would cost the railway and how much they would save the wider economy, was one element of the report. Another, however, was understanding what impact a reduction in rail fares like this would have on overcrowding. It is this part of the report that my own research has supported, and what I uncovered paints a picture that I don't think is hugely well understood about just how much less of an overall service we are running today versus the pre-COVID railway. First, it is worth looking at the current state of overcrowding on our railways, in particular those serving our major cities. Using DfT statistics, it is possible to attain the percentage of available seats on services running at peak and off-peak times in the major English and Welsh cities. Scotland is excluded from this data for devolution reasons. In turn, it is possible to list those cities that have the most acute overcrowding conditions versus those with spare capacity, giving us a rough guide of cities where investment ought to be prioritised. And so we have two maps, the green and the orange maps. The green map shows all-day off-peak available seats as a percentage of the total number of seats available throughout the day outside of peak time. So that's including those lightly used early and late trains. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other, the orange map shows AM and PM peak available seats. Not everywhere has a PM peak, but the AM and PM peak available seats as a percentage of the seats available during peak hours, whether that's just AM or if it's both AM and PM. From this, we get a pretty clear picture of, you can see across both, well, London here at peak time has negative 2% available seats. You can see, at peak time, Birmingham also severe pressures, Leeds severe pressures. We'll show these in a table momentarily. You see the picture is perhaps a little rosier during off-peak periods. But we'll talk about these. The numbers that we've looked at here should not be misinterpreted. The apparently high seat availability for off-peak periods include those services at the start and the end of the day that are invaluable for connecting travellers but don't add much to daily passenger figures. Similarly, 50% spare capacity means half of seats are free, which can be enough to trigger standing passengers on some services. From this data, tabulated here, the most congested cities across both peak and off-peak are London, which might be pretty obvious, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leicester, and Leeds. This should surprise nobody. The eastern leg of High Speed 2 was designed to release capacity for more local and regional services into these cities, and its cancellation has locked in capacity problems with no plans for improvement. This makes the shrinking timetable on the Midland Main Line even more insulting for passengers, or indeed ex-passengers, along that route, for whom the promise of high-speed rail and electrification had already been reversed. So let's dig into these numbers. So, at the top of the list, we've got London, priority ranking number 1, of course, fine. You've then, as we've talked about, you've got Sheffield, Birmingham, Leicester, Leeds here, kind of up to 5th in terms of the rankings. And yes, that is the Midlands and the East Midlands particularly. That is HS2 Eastern Leg territory. Next, you've got, in terms of priority, Newcastle, Reading, Liverpool and Manchester. So some of those sort of, you've got Newcastle and Reading, Liverpool, Manchester, Nottingham here. Those stations that, Nottingham, Bristol, it's saying Worth are pretty similar. Those large cities that fall out of this, out of these stats, I would say, are Brighton, Cardiff, and Cambridge, that don't see the same levels of overcrowding. Brighton and Cambridge notably have very long trains because they're at either ends of the London suburban railway network. Cardiff does benefit from a serious number of of seats into city seats coming through the city. It also has an expanding suburban network that is seeing expansion and seeing potentially a little bit of a lag on the uptake of those. So Brighton, Cardiff, Cambridge down here faring far better. However, the latest version of these statistics is from 2024, when passenger usage was around 70 to 80% of where it is today. The figures can be adjusted upwards accordingly, only painting a more chronic picture of capacity limitations. Now, these statistics always take time to be processed, validated and uploaded, but more recent data exists for the number of daily services and the average passengers per service on an operator-by-operator basis running up to the end of the 2025 financial year. In 2025, we were running 8% fewer services than we were in 2020, excluding the Elizabeth line. Yet the average loading per service was up 1% across all operators. That means on average, Britain is running fewer, more crowded trains. To paint a clear picture of the state of our railway service, though, we have to dig into the numbers on an operator-by-operator basis. Now, this table shows that the operators that cut the most services between 2020 and 2025 are Chiltern Railways and Govia Thameslink Railway, including Thameslink, Great Northern and Southern, with both having reduced the number of daily trains they run by around 20%. That's 1 in 5 2020 trains that has been cancelled. A substantial reduction. If growth wasn't the aim of the game, you might argue this was prudent, given passenger loadings on these trains are only slightly up despite this reduction. So, you have a look at these, 3%, 6%. It's not such a increase in overcrowding, despite the number of services that's being reduced. But growth is the name of the game, folks. Therefore, what passengers are we losing? What potential additional passengers could we be bringing onto the railway had we not chopped those services in the first place? However, Cross Country, ScotRail, Avanti West Coast, Southeastern and Northern all reduced their timetables between 10 and 15%. We know that Avanti have further contracted their timetable this summer following instructions from the DfT. And in the case of Cross Country and Avanti in particular, their passenger loadings are up by 12% and 8% respectively. For trains that were already regarded as overcrowded before 2020, this suggests that overcrowding is now worse than ever before and worsened by the reduction in daily trains. What am I talking about? We're looking at cross country here, 15% reduction in daily services and a almost, kind of a matched increase in the amount of overcrowding per service. Meanwhile, Avanti West Coast, similar reduction and you see nearly a 10%, 8% increase in passengers per service. So, it's not really a new fleet. That means an increase in overcrowding. Without listing all of them, there are a chunk of operators running marginally fewer trains per day than in 2020, but what is noteworthy among this group is the operators seeing greatly reduced average loadings per train. Heathrow Express, C2C, South Western Railway and South Eastern. In the latter three cases, these are operators that relied on the commuter ebb and flow in and out of London that has been greatly diminished post-pandemic. So that's kind of what's interesting is these three here. 16%, 15% and 25% reduction in the number of passengers per service. And these are services that I would argue were relying pretty heavily on pre-pandemic traffic. Heathrow Express is a particularly interesting one there, in terms of potentially reduced Heathrow traffic and flights in and out of Heathrow. That's interesting, particularly in relation to, some of the Heathrow airport news. We also see those operators that have actually increased the number of daily trains they run. Transport for Wales, Hull Trains, LNER and EMR, East Midlands, were running, this is East Midlands in 2025, by the way, folks, we're running at least a 5% greater timetable in 2025, and Grand Central were running 14% more trains a day in 2025 versus 2020. But what can we do with this information? By looking at where operators are running a lighter timetable than in 2020 or are running with lower loadings, we can understand where there is capacity to rapidly increase the number of available seats to ease overcrowding and, crucially, drive revenue growth. It also gives us a clear picture of those operators that are currently flat out and require wider investment to drive growth. This is shown here. For the operators up at the top of this list, the majority are running fewer trains today than in 2020, and so this presents the most straightforward route to growth. In the case of GWR, TfW Rail, London Overground and Merseyrail, where the timetable is at or slightly above 2020 levels, the only option for growth is increasing average train loadings. Ways this can be achieved include widening the use of demand-responsive fares, or reducing fares outright, or by using longer trains. For 6 operators, between 20 to 35% growth is possible by taking these measures. Another 6, by the way, that is the top 6 here. There we go. So that's Heathrow Express, South Eastern, Chiltern Railways, C2C, Govia Thameslink Railway and South Western Railway. So those are the ones where services have been fairly substantially cut and loadings are down. The next 6, though, can unlock 10 to 20% growth, with cross-country very much at the top of this second group. As an operator renowned for overcrowding, a new fleet of longer trains running to the 2020 timetable could provide significant relief and room for growth. Have a look at this. Cross-country. You don't want to make those trains any more overcrowded, but you can absolutely run a denser service and get nearly 20% growth as a result. But what of the operators with no room for quick growth? These are Hull Trains, LNER, East Midlands Railway and Grand Central. Both LNER and EMR are running trains with loadings almost 20% above 2020 levels. For Hull Trains, that figure's 45%. I suspect that huge number is influenced by the operator still running the Atalantes, as part of a mixed fleet in 2020. They're still bringing in the new Paragon and sort of Hitachis. And the 180s have smaller seating capacity. For those operators on the East Coast Main Line, the extremely dense December 2025 timetable has essentially filled every available slot on that railway while squeezing intermediate stops and services as much as politically palatable. The only way to improve capacity on the East Coast Main Line without entirely excluding local services is with new infrastructure. Once again, this is what HS2's Eastern leg via the East Midlands and Yorkshire would have achieved. All of this ties into a final crucial point that remains poorly communicated. GB rail usage is now at 110% of pre-COVID levels, while car usage has lagged behind since 2024. Only since April this year has car demand relative to pre-COVID levels started catching up with relative rail passenger demand. Given current policy decisions, this makes sense. Prior to the pandemic, the railways were saturated. As we've discussed already, across almost half of operators and all of the long-distance operators, trains are more overcrowded now than they were in 2020. As was the case in 2020, we have a diminishing ability to expand, particularly on the mainline corridors, so growth in passenger numbers will slow. We will see this line flatten out as we essentially reach the same saturation point we were before 2020 when I was going on and on and on about high-speed rail and HS2 repeatedly until I went blue in the face. Combine this with the policies of the current government, not least the further reductions in timetabled service over and above those already instigated during the pandemic, and it is clear to see why the brilliant momentum we've seen up to a few months ago has stalled. This is compounded by further fuel duty freezes for drivers amidst rising rail fares. To hide from this doom and gloom, I wanted to take us over to the world of walking, wheeling and cycling, and for tonight's bonus we'll be looking at Active Travel England's new rural design guidance. How ambitious is it? How useful is it? And what difference will it make? Tune in at 21:30 tonight for the live page turn. But you might be wondering, how the hell do you get hold of the bonus? How the hell do you listen to Trains Atlantic? Well, for £5 or more, you get the free audiobook of How the Rails Will Fix the Future, as well as access to the weekly bonus episodes with the full back catalogue, adding a sizable chunk to the Rail Natter canon. We're up to like nearly 50 episodes now. Go to patreon.com/Gareth Dennis to subscribe. With the attacks on Iran and closure of the Strait of Hormuz kind of hokey-cokeying with a little sign of abating, we draw nearer to a potentially catastrophic fuel price cliff edge, one that the railway ought to be perfectly placed to ease by providing highly efficient, if not completely electric alternatives to the car. Yet we continue to see only a retreat in government's ambitions around railway investment, with no change in direction on delivering high-speed rail beyond Birmingham, new cross-Pennine lines being limited to upgrades on the existing corridor, and yet another wholesale cancellation of electrification. In the latter case, this is particularly embarrassing given the live demonstration in the form of the EMR Aurora fleet and its inability to run a reliable 125-mile-an-hour bi-mode operation away from the wires. A year ago, the Rail Minister said this to the House of Commons Transport Committee. One of the reasons why further electrification of the Midland Main Line went down the list was that the trains bought as bi-mode trains will produce better service, more capacity, and will be better trains. They'll be able to use the wires where they exist and to run where they do not. With that bi-mode fleet struggling to the point that services have been cut drastically, we know now that this is not true. Electrification doesn't just enable greater capacity by enabling more trains per hour, it is necessary to run the existing service reliably given the gradients and curvatures on the Midland Main Line now that the diesel-only fleet is departing. As we've demonstrated in relation to overcrowding and capacity, comments around the lack of need to accommodate growth have also been shown to be misinformed, with passenger increases now being constrained by overcrowding and service cuts. The best journey to reducing the reliance on subsidy, one of the few aims set for Great British Railways by this government, is to increase revenue with more bums on seats. Isn't it about time that the government reversed course and exploited the railway's ability to solve both the UK's lacklustre economic position and the increasingly acute cost of living pressures on most of its citizens? It is no coincidence that it is the cities and regions along the former eastern leg of HS2 that are the ones suffering with the most congestion, that stand to gain the most by major public transport investment that is not arriving. Britain is seeing multiple crises overlaid. We are seeing a climate crisis manifesting in fires across our moorlands and increasingly, getting increasingly close to our built-up areas. We have a chronic cost of living crisis, and we have issues to do with transport isolation, poverty, loneliness of the elderly. And we have an economic crisis. Britain is in the doldrums economically. Major public transport investment of the scale of the eastern leg of HS2 or similar are absolutely the pathway to escaping some of these problems. In fact, most of these problems, and yet government is uninterested. And that's frustrating. But for us in Rail Natter Towers, being armed with the knowledge and the data to make this case more cogently and more angrily and embarrass government into action, well, that's what allows us to make change happen. Everyone, it's an absolute delight. I'll see you for the bonus. Cheerio. It's pep talk time. There's not really much to say about the 315s. York built, mostly known for their use on TfL rail until they got replaced by the Aventras in recent years. The last one was running just short of 2023. Still, a reliable stalwart and we salute them. This one, by the way, looking mostly BR blue, other than the cheeky little Network Southeast flash at the front. Anyway, the 315s.